So your first question maybe, who is this person and who is she to speak about this topic? So over 10 years ago, I started my career in development. For a couple of years, I worked as a project manager for a donor organization in rural Tunisia. It was the GIZ. And I worked in the field of integrated natural resource management. As many other young development professionals, I was really led by the motivation to contribute to social change and development. I was like a real idealist, and I wanted to change the world, of course. So when I arrived in Tunisia in 2012, the country has just been through its revolution, and democracy was on the rise, and many donors had come to fund democracy building with millions and millions of euros and dollars. However, Tunisia was still democracy in its baby shoes. They didn't have a constitution, and many state institutions were still to be rebuilt. Civil society also was about to evolve, and local development stakeholders in rural areas were still very much used to the former government's top-down approach to natural resource management. Of course, donors all arrived at the same time. And of course, they all had the same idea, which in the field of natural resource management was to work with the Ministry of Agriculture and the only rural grassroots organization that was said to function more or less democratically. So what happened was that donors all had the same beneficiaries, but didn't have the same approaches. Part of the problem was that even though we all spoke about democracy and democracy building, we didn't always talk about the same thing. So democracy, just like coordination and cooperation, as we will see now, is one of the biggest buzzwords in development. So from my perspective, this very complex situation in Tunisia, but which we also see elsewhere, led to many development projects not really achieving their objectives. This included the program I worked for at that time. I was disillusioned, but I didn't quit development. I decided to go back to university and to invest a couple of years in a PhD, during which I studied and analyzed the exact phenomenon of complex development stakeholder landscapes and the consequences on coordination and cooperation. So this conference's goal was to foster, or is to foster, an exchange between stakeholders active in your field here in Ethiopia, and to obtain a better understanding of the cooperation and coordination mechanisms between stakeholders. Unfortunately, we have seen this morning that cooperation and coordination has not been very successful during the past years, and most of the objectives have not been achieved. Too many cooks spoil the broth, said one of my research participants, a representative of civil society, who I interviewed for my study in 2018. What did she mean by that? She meant that development stakeholders landscape that was heavily overcrowded, complex, and overfunded would not achieve or change anything at the end of the day. As a lot of research shows, this is typically the case in contexts where, first of all, many development donors with different interests are active. And, well, they basically throw money at local stakeholders without really communicating among themselves. Then this is also the case for contexts where local governments don't or can't take over the role of the coordinator. Sometimes because they don't have the resources, but also sometimes because they simply have other interests in mind. And we will talk about that later on. It is also very typical for contexts where local civil society organizations cannot fulfill the role of the democratic watchdog and cannot be drivers of social change. Instead, many civil society organizations, many NGOs have become business-driven and are not motivated to fight for or achieve social change. They have become simple service providers and often only follow the donor's lead. Other civil society organizations which are still driven by the motivation to foster social change and development may then be hindered to participate politically because of shrinking civic spaces or because they lack the capacities to implement development projects, especially when they come with a big fat budget. Then finally, this is also typical for contexts where beneficiaries of development projects are not organized, or at least they are not organized according to donors' standards and expectations. And this very much goes for beneficiaries at grassroots level. And therefore, donors especially, they seem to lack accountable potential partners at the grassroots level. So such a complex development stakeholders landscape often results in donors spending money for the sake of spending and not really to achieve social change or promote development. So as I already said, such a complex development stakeholders landscape often results in donors spending money for the sake of spending. They don't really promote social change or development anymore. Then it also results in funding being misused by different stakeholders, not just by donors, but also maybe by local stakeholders. And of course, benefits not trickling down to local beneficiaries, especially those at grassroots level. Donors, governments, and local civil society organizations also artificially inflate when too much funding is available and needs to be spent. So this is the phenomenon of recruiting and recruiting and recruiting over and over again. And then finally, it also results in donors competing over beneficiaries, over visibility. So it's about who has the bigger logo. And I've followed the conference or parts of the conference this morning, and I saw a big banner with many, many logos, so it made me laugh. And they also compete over innovation. So who has the most innovative project or program, which leads to an enormous amount of pilot projects, but which at the end of the day never really see institutionalization. Next slide, please. Thanks. Most importantly, however, such a constellation has negative consequences for development projects beneficiaries at grassroots level. These include that beneficiaries become the play ball of bigger development stakeholders, and their needs are not longer at the core of development projects. That beneficiaries are being instrumentalized often by the government, but also by donors, of course, to access more funding. And then finally, this leads to little to no impact and positive change for beneficiaries. This means that development goals, not just at the program level, but also at a more global level. So when we think about the SDGs, for example, that these goals remain unachieved. And it actually made me wonder if by following such approaches, we are still within the do no harm logic, or if we are not actually doing harm. I have talked about this topic at several conferences, and at the end, I'm usually asked, okay, so then what is needed to achieve development objectives despite the complexity of certain development stakeholder landscapes? How can we achieve coordination and cooperation? Or how can we actually achieve these development objectives? And of course, the answer seems so obvious because it is coordination and also cooperation. Next slide, please. So coordination and cooperation sounds so easy, right? But these also are two very famous development buzzwords. So development buzzwords, this means that things sound really great at first, but then no one really knows what they actually mean. So what does it mean, coordination? So, of course, there are many different definitions of coordinations, and one that I find most interesting is the following. So, coordination means the unification, integration, the synchronization of the efforts of group members to provide unity of action in the pursuit of common goals. Coordination of development stakeholders, however, only rarely works well, and especially in very complex settings. So why is this so? Next slide. When working in development, we need to be honest with ourselves, and we are rarely being that, actually. Aid is not provided for altruistic reasons. Instead, development donors in particular, and wherever they are from, they come with a variety of interests. And this also goes for local, and in your case, of course, Ethiopian stakeholders. And these interests do not necessarily align. So what kind of interests do I speak about? So first of all, these interests, they can be political or economic. And when we think about donors and their interest in Ethiopia, then clearly Ethiopia is of very strategic interest to donors, right? Especially for northern-based, or also we call them Western donors, it is of geostrategic importance. Ethiopia is also one of the fastest growing non-oil producing economies, and it is among the countries with the fastest improving Human Development Index rankings. Ethiopia is also often referred to as a developmental state, and it is also what is called a donor's darling. So it is argued that Ethiopia has a very strong-willed leadership, which is very committed to delivering on ambitious development plans. And this, of course, renders them very attractive as donor partners. Then different stakeholders also come from different cultural backgrounds, and they have different history, and they have maybe also different values. Just like the donors who have started to work on democracy building in Tunisia right after the revolution without coordinating or defining what democracy actually means, donors in Ethiopia have probably come to the table with very different worldviews and very different definitions of those buzzwords I was talking about, including the two buzzwords coordination and cooperation. Then the interests that are often overseen are personal interests. So personal interests of persons who work within the various development organizations and institutions. Their personal motivation to work in the field, for example, personal values, backgrounds, but also, why not, career goals. So, for example, Ethiopia might be a project manager's last posting before retirement. Her motivation to rock the boat or to invest time in stakeholder coordination, which, of course, according to her long experience, only rarely works out, might be very low. A younger person, a young professional, might not want to rock the boat either, afraid that their criticism might have negative consequences for their career. Then finally, another person in turn might see his posting as a chance to promote or foster his career. He might be driven by his ego and therefore more interesting in creating, once again, visibility for his organization or for himself, rather than in contributing to social change through real successful coordination with other stakeholders. Because of these different interests, it is very difficult to align on one strategy or speak with one voice, or, for example, appoint one leader that would manage the cooperation. A second reason why stakeholder coordination is so difficult to achieve is the functioning of the development system. So we all know that traditionally in development, we work with project approaches, and these are often limited in time. They usually come with their own block frame. They come with their own budget, and this budget, of course, must be spent within a given time frame. So in Ethiopia, projects often find themselves with too much funding, and no one knows what to do with the money in the given time period. Because the money needs to be spent, stakeholders start funding activities or buy material that only rarely contribute to the achievement of development goals. So they'll buy new office furniture for a partner, they would organize only more or less useful exchange trips for delegations. And we know that many of these trips are never being followed up. Or typically, and as I said earlier on, they would just recruit more and more staff, which at the end of the day makes the stakeholder landscape even more overcrowded. Then, of course, many donors also continue to impose projects and activities or a vision of development on their southern partners, either directly by approaching them with preconceived projects or programs, or indirectly by, for example, only funding certain types of activities. I often heard partners suggesting activities which, however, were not being funded because donors just said, oh no, they are not in our strategy, so we can't really fund them. And this shows that donor strategies often do not match their partners' strategy, which is, of course, highly problematic, especially in contexts where donors hold power over financial resources, and at the end of the day, can decide what will be funded and what not. Then last but not least, projects are often relatively inflexible. This may become extremely problematic in contexts which are volatile or uncertain. And we've seen that a lot during the past 2 years with the COVID-19 pandemic. And yeah, this is problematic, and especially where priorities might change relatively spontaneously. Finally, a third reason why stakeholder coordination is so difficult to achieve is that coordination usually does not come for free. Coordination is extremely resource intensive, especially in complex stakeholder landscapes. It demands human resources and, for example, persons who overview, monitor, manage, etc., as well as the famous resource of time, of which in development we never really have any to spare. The resources coordination tasks demand are often underestimated, and also resources are often not efficiently allocated. And yes, coordination is also a lot about the resource of power, and it is a lot about power sharing. Power, however, is like a cake. There is only so much of it, and if you share it with others, chances are that your piece of cake becomes smaller. And given donor strategic interests in Ethiopia and other interests I talked about earlier on, sharing the cake does not necessarily come first. Now let's talk about cooperation. Next slide, please. The notion of cooperation is, of course, very much linked to coordination. And indeed, a good coordination also requires the cooperation of stakeholders and vice versa. So cooperation is, and I like this definition, is the act of working together for a common purpose or benefit. It differs from coordination because coordination describes the management of this act, and this act is cooperation. This means that cooperation doesn't work without coordination, and coordination without cooperation is just void of action and thus void of effects. A real cooperation in development would consist of a group of development stakeholders coming together under the same flag, namely the same strategy and the same log frame and one common budget. However, just like coordination, cooperation may be very challenging. Next slide, please. So first of all, donors usually follow different procedures. They have different reporting systems, different administrative requirements. Financial flows are also different. Many also have very different development strategies. And usually projects and programs are based on these development strategies. As already mentioned before, donors, especially in overcrowded stakeholder landscapes, often compete with each other. For many, visibility, as I said, in forms of logos and signs is often more important than impact. And obviously this impedes cooperation, as one donor always wants to trump the other. Cooperation, especially in development, is often also understood as partnership. But then, of course, the question is, what is partnership? And actually, partnership implies always a certain degree of equality. And this is certainly not given in a cooperation where one party holds the financial power over the other. In development contexts, this is typically the donor, and most often the donor with the biggest wallet. So what would be a way forward to overcome all these challenges and to achieve a realistic coordination and cooperation of activities? Next slide, please. I would now like to invite you to join me in a personal reflection about stakeholder coordination and cooperation in Ethiopia. So you have 15 minutes to reflect upon the questions that you will see on the screen after this slide. And of course, these questions are related to the reasons which hinder coordination in the context of Ethiopia. So if I'm not mistaken, you'll find a couple of cards and pens on your tables, and I would like you to write down your thoughts anonymously if you want. And if you want, of course, you can discuss also your thoughts with your neighbors. You do not have to write down a thought for every question, because you'll see there are many. And then at the end, so after 15 minutes, you may hand over the cards to our moderator, who will then, I think, attach them to the wall. And this is how later on you'll have a gallery of thoughts, through which you can wander, for example, during the coffee break, drinking good coffee. So next slide, please. So as I said, there are a couple of questions, and I will just read them out loud, and then you'll have 15 minutes, but of course you can already start. For those who are here online, I have prepared a Padlet, and I think the Meta team will share it with you in the chat. Yes, so here are the questions. So first of all, what are the economic and political interests your organization has in Ethiopia, and how do they interfere with stakeholder coordination? Then second, what are the buzzwords in your field that need to be defined, and how do you define these buzzwords? Then what is your personal motivation to work in your field, and does it interfere with stakeholder coordination? Then what are the rules that the development system imposes on you and your organization? Then what concrete resources does your organization or institution have that may be used to promote coordination or cooperation, of course? And then if you have any other comments that you would like to share, then please do so. So I see in the chat that I should wrap up. What does it mean? Do we have 15 minutes for the group for the discussion?
Yes, it's just wrapping up the introduction presentation, which
okay.
is which you have done now, so that's okay.
Okay, perfect. Then yes, please take 15 minutes, and Rainer, if you can please share the link to the Padlet for those who participate online. So it's rather self-explaining. Just click on the link, and then you'll see a screen with a couple of sections, and just click on the pluses to add your thoughts, to add like post-its. If you have any questions, maybe you can share. You can ask me, and I can explain one more time. Okay, see you in 15 minutes.